Alright, today I'm going to show you how to use multi-factor authentication with WireGuard and Pro Custodibus. I'm going to cover three things: how it works behind the scenes, how to set it up as an admin, and how to use it as a device user. So behind the scenes, how does it work? Well, it takes advantage of the pre-shared keys built into WireGuard authentication. Now, the core of WireGuard's authentication mechanism lies with the public key pair that identifies a WireGuard peer uniquely. When two peers set up an encrypted connection, each peer uses its own private key plus the other peer's public key. And this allows the peers to generate an ephemeral symmetric key that will be used to actually encrypt the data tunneled through the connection. So this is the classic Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and for WireGuard it follows the specific steps defined by the noise protocol framework, which mutually authenticates two peers to each other at the same time as it establishes the shared ephemeral encryption key. And this mutual authentication and key agreement is what we call the WireGuard handshake between the two peers. So this process also allows for a symmetric pre-shared key to be mixed into the handshake process, where each peer must know the value of this key in order to correctly complete the process. So in this diagram you see that we've configured the connection between peer C and peer A with a pre-shared key of YYY123 blah blah blah, which has to be configured on both sides of the connection. So peer C has that pre-shared key with YYY123 blah blah blah, and peer A has that same pre-shared key YYY123 blah blah blah. And if we change the pre-shared key on one side of the connection, for example, if we reconfigure peer C to use a pre-shared key of XXX456 blah blah blah, this will prevent either side of the connection from successfully performing another handshake, and WireGuard requires a handshake every 2 minutes. So at that point, this WireGuard tunnel will be broken and neither side of the connection will be able to communicate with the other. But if we also change the pre-shared key on the other side of the connection to XXX456 blah blah blah, so that both sides match, this will allow the two peers to successfully complete their handshake, keeping the WireGuard tunnel up and operational, or if it had gone down, this allows the tunnel to be reestablished. So, how does this work with Pro Custodibus? Well, in this diagram we've got a similar setup as the previous diagram, with host C here connected over WireGuard to host A, both using the same pre-shared key of YYY123 blah blah blah. And what we can do with Pro Custodibus is to periodically, like once an hour, once a day, once a week, rotate the pre-shared key on just one side of the connection, which will break the WireGuard tunnel. So here we have rotated the pre-shared key on just the host C side to be XXX456 blah blah blah, and broken the connection between host C and host A. So now, in order for a user using host A to reestablish this connection, that user using host A has to open up a web browser and authenticate herself with Pro Custodibus. And once she does this, Pro Custodibus will update host A with the matching pre-shared key of XXX456 blah blah blah, allowing the WireGuard tunnel between host A and host C to be reestablished. So this is really cool because we take the standard WireGuard authentication mechanism, which mutually authenticates these two hosts using the public key pair stored on each host, and we layer on top of it an additional authentication mechanism where the user herself authenticates to Pro Custodibus using her own credentials. So from a multi-factor authentication perspective, the user using host A is authenticating both with a thing she has, the public key pair stored on host A, as well as a thing she knows, her password for Pro Custodibus. Or from a zero trust perspective, the public key pair stored on host A authenticates the device, whereas the credentials the user uses to log into Pro Custodibus authenticates the user. So that's part one, how multi-factor authentication with WireGuard works conceptually. Now for part two, I'll show you how to set this up with Pro Custodibus using a real-world example. So here we've got two overlapping WireGuard networks, one in blue, which connects a bunch of user devices to several clusters of internal servers, and the other in green here, which connects the clusters themselves. So for example, Justin's laptop can connect to the DB cluster gateway over WireGuard, and from there access the DB1 or DB2 servers, or we can connect to the log cluster gateway and from there access the log1 and log2 servers. And the servers in the internal DB cluster itself can connect over the second WireGuard network to the app cluster or to the log cluster. So I'm going to show you how we can apply multi-factor authentication to the connections from just these user devices, like from Justin's laptop to the DB cluster, without applying them to the server-to-server communications, like from the app cluster to the DB cluster, where we don't have a human in the loop. And in fact, for these infrastructure connections, what we can do instead is set up the pre-shared keys used by these connections to be rotated automatically together simultaneously so that they always stay in sync, but we still get the benefits of regular key rotation, so that if the WireGuard keys for our infrastructure network were exfiltrated from one of these cluster gateways, there would only be a limited time window in which the attacker who stole them could actually use them. So let's go to the Pro Custodibus admin UI. And if we go to the admin page here, we now have a key rotation link under the administration panel that you can follow. And from here, you can start creating key rotation policies by clicking this add icon. And when we create a key rotation policy, we can specify whether or not we're going to make this a multi-factor authentication policy. So let's create one policy that applies to the connections between our user devices and some of our production infrastructure. We'll call this prod user devices so that we can remember what this policy is for, and we'll give it an ordinal of 101. So that's the order in which these policies are evaluated. Lower ordinals are evaluated first, and we'll give it a rotation interval of 1 hour so that users will have to re-authenticate every hour if they want to continue to use their connection to this production infrastructure. And we'll select the MFA checkbox to rotate these pre-shared keys just on the server side of the connection, forcing users to log into Pro Custodibus to synchronize the keys on the client side. And for this unmonitored checkbox, this is something that you'll usually want to leave unchecked. Leaving it unchecked means this policy will apply only to connections that have the Pro Custodibus agent installed on both sides of the connections. So once we get these properties set, we'll click the add button, and now we can start selecting the peers that will apply this policy to. And first one, I'm going to apply this to the app cluster, but I'm going to make sure that I apply it to the peer that is used by the user devices network, not the infrastructure to infrastructure network. And I'm also going to add the log cluster, again using that user devices network, not the infrastructure network. And one more, let's do the DB cluster. So any connection to the WireGuard interfaces that use these peers will require multi-factor authentication once an hour. So this means that if an adversary stole one of the laptops that have access to these clusters over the user devices network, or steals the WireGuard keys for that network off of one of these laptops, the adversary would have at most 1 hour to use these WireGuard keys before they're rotated of these cluster gateways, after which it no longer have access. Now if I have some different servers that I want to apply a different policy to, like say I want to set up a rotation interval of 1 day instead of 1 hour for our mail servers, I can set up a separate policy for that. So I enter user mail in the description and 2 for the policy ordinal and a rotation interval this time of 1 day. And again, I'm going to make it a multi-factor authentication policy. And click add, and I'll add the mail cluster as a peer. This again using the user devices network. So this will apply to any user device trying to access a mail server through the mail cluster. And on the other side of the equation, if I have some specific user devices that I want to apply a different policy to, I can do that as well. So for example, if I want to apply a shorter rotation interval to certain user devices, like an interval of just 10 minutes, to some devices that I'm more worried about the security of, I can create another policy for that and give it a description of risky devices, and I'll enter 99 for the policy ordinal, so this will get applied in preference to the other 2 policies that we just created, which had ordinal values of 101 and 102, and make the rotation interval 10 minutes and make it a multi-factor authentication policy. Click add, and now we can specify the client peers that we want to apply this policy to. And I'm going to apply it just to Justin's laptop here. And now if we wanted to create a key rotation policy just for our infrastructure to infrastructure connections where we don't have a human in the loop, we can create one, but instead of selecting the MFA option, we'll leave this MFA checkbox unselected, so that this policy instead will rotate the pre-shared key of both sides of the connection simultaneously, and so that no human authentication is necessary. So I'll give this a description of prod infra to infra, and I'm going to give it a policy ordinal of 103 and a rotation interval of say 1 day. And this time I'm not going to select the MFA checkbox, and click add, and now I'll add our production gateway clusters here, and this time I'm going to select the peer identity that's used for the infrastructure to infrastructure network, and same thing for our log cluster, infra to infra, and same thing for the DB cluster. So now any connection to the WireGuard interfaces that use these peers, as long as both sides of the connection are managed by Pro Custodibus, will have their pre-shared key rotated on both sides once a day. So that's part 2, how to set up multi-factor authentication. Now let's look at part 3, how to use it. And how to use it, there's basically 3 different mechanisms. The first is, as an admin, we can check on the rotation state of each connection and also bypass multi-factor authentication for a particular user. For example, if a user can't get our credentials to work and only needs to access a particular connection, we can bypass multi-factor authentication temporarily for that user. So if we look on our host page here and look at, say, the app cluster, we can click on the managed pre-shared keys icon of the host to view the rotation state of all its connections. And we can see from this page that all of the hosts of the infrastructure to infrastructure connections are covered by our policy 103 prod infra to infra, and that will rotate the pre-shared keys used by these connections once a day, and they're all okay because they're going to be both sides of the connection are going to be rotated simultaneously. And then there are also some user devices connected to this host that use a different policy, policy 101, and that's a multi-factor authentication policy with a rotation interval of 1 hour. And then we have a special policy just for Justin's laptop with a rotation interval of 10 minutes. And none of these multi-factor connections are operable at this point because no one's logged in yet with multi-factor authentication to use them. We can also navigate to Justin's laptop, go to the host page for that, and click the Manage Pre-Shares Key icon to see the rotation state of all the connections from Justin's laptop. And we can see that all of these connections are governed by our special multi-factor authentication policy that applies just to Justin's laptop, and none of these connections are operable yet. So as an admin, I can click on the synchronize key icon of a connection, and this would now allow Justin to access the WireGuard connection to our mail servers once the pre-shared key for this connection has been synchronized by the Pro Custodibus agent running on his laptop, which might take a minute or two depending on when the agent next connects to the Pro Custodibus servers. But once that happens, the connection will be available then for the next 10 minutes until the pre-shared key for that connection between the mail cluster and Justin's laptop is rotated again by our special policy 99. So if I refresh the page, we can see that now that key has been synchronized on the laptop, so the connection is now available and I can check my mail. But of course, you normally wouldn't want to have your admins using their admin privileges to override multi-factor authentication. Usually, you want to have your users to log in themselves and use their own credentials to prove that that's who they are. So for each host that represents a user device in Pro Custodibus, we want to make sure that we've created a user for that device and associated them with that host. So if we go back to the main page for Justin's laptop and scroll down to the users panel, we can see that we have set up Justin as a user for this host. And we could add additional users by clicking the add icon and selecting a user. We could select Adam, and in this case we want to make that user a regular user type. But for most devices, you usually just want to have 2 users associated with that host, one being the Pro Custodibus agent running on that host, and the other being the human user of that host. And we can also associate a user to a host via their own user profile. If I drill into this users page, we can see the host here to which this user has access. And if there were multiple devices that Justin used, we could add multiple devices like Vikram's laptop for some reason I would use. I don't know why. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But I could add them here on this page. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to log out from this admin account that I've been using and log in using this regular user account to show you how the multi-factor authentication flow for a regular user would work. So I'm going to log in as this user. If I type in the password correctly, then we'll have logged in as this regular user and can see the list of WireGuard connections for my user devices that Pro Custodibus manages. And if, say, I want to now access the log cluster, I can click the synchronize key icon for it, and this will now allow me to access that WireGuard connection once the pre-shared key for this connection has been synchronized by the Pro Custodibus agent running on my laptop. And again, that can potentially take a minute or two depending on when the agent next connects to the Pro Custodibus servers. But if I refresh the page, I can see that my connection to the log cluster is now available, and I can go ahead and check out some logs from production. And if I'm a command line user, I can alternatively use the command line interface for the Pro Custodibus agent running on my laptop to check this authentication state, as well as perform multi-factor authentication itself. So from a terminal on my laptop here, I can run the Pro Custodibus MFA command and see the rotation state of the WireGuard connections on my laptop. And you can see that this lists the same connections as we saw in the Pro Custodibus UI, where only the connections to my log cluster and mail cluster are available. But note also that this command required administrative privileges on the laptop, which is why I use sudo for it. But you can also check the state of a specific individual connection with the -- check flag, and this doesn't require admin privileges, so you might find it more useful for custom scripts. And with this check flag, I also have to specify the ID of a particular endpoint. And so we can say this particular endpoint has expired. And finally, you can also perform the multi-factor authentication itself using the -- auth flag. So if I wanted to access a machine in this test cluster, I can do that by running the a command with the -- auth flag. And to do that, I need to pass my user ID as that first argument to the -- auth command, and then I also need to specify a particular endpoint, so I'll copy and paste this endpoint ID of the test cluster. And when I run this command, then I need to type in my password to Pro Custodibus. If I type in that password correctly, then it will synchronize the pre-shared key for that connection with the test cluster to my laptop. So now I can use that WireGuard connection to it until 12:51. So that's the multi-factor authentication flow as a regular user, and that is how you can use multi-factor authentication with WireGuard and Pro Custodibus.